Okay, hello and welcome everyone. I see many of you on today's session. Delighted that you're all here attending. So we're going to start today's session here, and it's entitled The Challenge of Securing Transportation IT Systems. My name is Sasha Farbach. I'm the cybersecurity evangelist here at Fudo Security. And on today's session, I'm also joined by my colleague, Rafał Wiosna, pre-sales engineer, who will help me with today's presentation.
Hello,
so let's
everyone.
get going. Hi, Rafał. Let's begin. So just briefly on our agenda today, this session will take roughly about 25 to 30 minutes. We'll cover everything, hopefully, in the time allotted. We'll be covering today the threats facing the transportation sector. We'll also be talking about what can be done and steps that can be taken to mitigate that cyber risk. What are some of the operational security challenges? And then also, Rafał will show us a use case where actually you can see what can be done to reduce privileged misuse. Everyone is muted here today, so if you have any questions, please hold them until the end. We'll have some time for questions and answers at the end. We'll also be running a couple of feedback polls and information to the audience here today, so really appreciate if you can participate in that. Right. So moving into transportation. So first of all, it's a huge sector. And what do we exactly mean by that? How do we define that? How do we define transportation? So if we're looking at examples from the United States, for instance, we have CISA, which is the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, and they are actually looking at various sectors here, subsectors, and this is comprises for them basically aviation, mass transit and passenger rail, pipeline systems, highway and motor carriers, maritime transportation systems, freight rail, postal and shipping. So really the vitality and the entire spread and spectrum of the sector's interconnected nature here is obviously really tempting target for cyber criminals. So we're looking at trains, at planes, cars, boats, and even Uber in that case. And also with the US, the Department of Homeland Security actually has designated the transportation sector as one of the critical infrastructure sectors. There's 16 of them. And basically they believe that the disruption of this system would have a really, really debilitating, catastrophic effect on US national security. So again, the nature of this is absolutely, it's not just about financial loss here. This is really critical about safety of people and the greater infrastructure of a nation. And this applies not just in the United States, but into Europe and other parts of the world. Right, so as I already said, we have a really key link here with transportation. So just the freight rail alone already, and that's billions and billions of dollars. In the US, this transports 1.6 million carloads of agriculture, over 70% of the nation's coal supply. It employs hundreds of thousands of people. We have some problems, obviously. We see here as well, we have a very long time for breaches to be detected in general. So 6 months, that's the average, really. So you can see a lot of damage that could be done by hackers and criminals in that time. We have another unfortunate statistic, about 40% of public transit agencies are looking at underground systems and railway systems for major cities. They don't even have a cybersecurity response plan, and many of them are not prepared for anything that could go wrong. So this is something worrying as well. We have a very high breach cost, and that rose again into 2021. So we're looking, I think it went from about 3.5 million on average to 4.2 million. So really, really high average there in terms of anything going wrong. And of course, we have the issue of digital transformation. Obviously, a lot of fantastic opportunities, a lot of data that's being used and integrated in new systems and OT systems and smart technology. But with that comes a lot of headache, comes a lot of vulnerability, as everything is then connected to different systems. You have different vendors, different types of connections. And you can imagine that creates a massive web of vulnerabilities. So again, just to see a little bit more in detail here what that means. So we have, of course, as in many other sectors, admin accounts, which are just increasing. There's a proliferation of admin accounts. This is a problem in many, many industries. and the transportation sector is no exception. We have, of course, more and more activity even before the COVID pandemic by remote users tapping into different things, different systems, looking at how to engage various signaling things, perhaps looking at different vendors that are used from anything from aviation to public transport to freight and rail. Many of these industries, especially in transport, have a history of legacy systems. So if we're looking back a few years, much of these, if we're looking at air traffic control or rail signaling, switching systems, everything like this, these were in the past, actually in the last few decades, were physically separated from the other networks. So this was something known in the industry as air gapping. So that meant that transportation operations basically required for those developers to make systems available and interoperate with others, but they weren't really built with cybersecurity in mind. So this air gap became really the only defense, but there's not a great security feature that's going to protect critical systems going into future and looking at intrusions or cyber attacks. And of course, as time has gone on, we've had now in the past decade, a lot of business objectives change. So looking at lower costs, looking at how to make operations more efficient, trying to meet certain regulatory compliance rules, making more strategic decisions. So basically in all these things, especially in IoT, including certain intelligent transportation systems, a lot of things were integrated into this air gap. And so now you have various systems that are not ever intended to connect in this way. And then you have, unless you looking at building something like a new railway hub or an airport, everything is new and everything's at the highest standard. You have things that are still lagging behind. You have things that are still operating at something that was never intended to be so interconnected. So technology challenges as well, of course. So we have so much information currently. If you look at a typical maybe railway station, you have, for instance, everything connected to signals, you have ticketing systems, you have the communications between the conductors and drivers, you have the actual visual screen and boards, which are displaying information about different types of arrival times. So someone could potentially connect to that through, obviously they run through Windows by using an RDP session. Then you have access to that system. And then, potentially, God forbid, there's, lateral movement. This could go into privilege access systems. And obviously a lot of things can be done, can be changed. This could lead to a lot of trouble. And of course, we have the regulation and compliance challenge, and much has changed over the years. We are now all familiar with things like GDPR, PCI DSS, of course, for financial and card information. And we're looking at things like, biometrics, personal data connected with compliance as well. There's also various regulations like ISO 27001. So all these different things combine to make this an incredibly challenging environment, an incredibly vulnerable environment for not just those who are using these systems behind the scenes, but also for all the freight and all the passengers that are using these services on a daily basis. So if we're looking at taking a little bit closer on what we're trying to secure here in this sector, let's break that down a little bit more. So obviously we have things like customer details. So typical things like, vital things when people are sharing information like their usernames, their passwords, date of births, credit card information. Again, we have the PCI DSS compliance regulation. We need all these things that need to be secured and protected. If we're looking at CCTV video, this is something that is now everywhere. It's useful. We can see where people are going, but is this really closed circuit? Where is this information being sent to? Is there someone maybe changing it? Or maybe some people going to be turning it off? Why are they turning it off? Could this be because of theft, criminal damage, potentially even something worse like terrorism? So you can start to extrapolate that this kind of information, in particular if we're looking at transportation, public transportation and railway systems, the potential consequences could be quite severe. Looking also at signals. I mean, this is something that affects subways, or if you want to say underground, trains, different things, switching. So these are really important things. And if this kind of information, given like the interplay between operational systems and new systems, if this is somehow manipulated or hacked or not working properly, this can create some real damage here as well. We have massive junctions in all major European cities, very much heavily designed on rail. And there have been incidents of this, which I'll cover in a little while later, where certain breaches have occurred, where things could have gone much worse. Also looking at GPS, looking at tracking, sat nav, this kind of information, really vital. What's using this? All kinds of devices, all kinds of transportation things. We're looking at maybe ride sharing services like Uber or Bolt, or aircraft control. So essentially, just a practical example, if you're looking at, say, something like ride sharing services like Uber, if someone is changing that signaling, the person go the other way or not find you at all, and that might not be very dangerous, but it's incredibly inconvenient. But if we look at potentially aircraft control for this, or certain railway services, this becomes also a very different story, and a very worrying one at that. Ticketing systems as well. I mean, we traditionally would go straight to the ticketing operator and just buy a ticket, but now everything's changed. So it's no longer just on-site, it's very much web-based. So you're thinking, okay, so where's the trouble in that? So web-based buying ticketing systems usually will be using a third party. And how is that third party going to be connected? How is that third party actually doing the right thing with their security? Are they linked straight into their central system and the ticketing operator, wherever at a major European or global city? What happens if that third party is breached? So if we're looking at that as well, I'm just thinking right away what happened just a few months ago with the Kaseya supply chain cyber attack, where we had an effect of over 50 MSPs. I think it was around July. And that ransomware attack spread to, I think, between 500 and 1,200 businesses worldwide. So we have here an example of what could go wrong, and because it very much did. Also put down here weather information, which may not really be that important if you first think about it. But if we're looking at particularly aviation, that might not really be dangerous, but it could be malicious. You confuse passengers. Worst case, also when planes are coming in, they might be not really reading the right information. So again, these are all the things combined where the information itself and certain details can wreak a lot of havoc and create a lot of problems, which may, at its most basic level, delay things, add confusion. But in our interconnected world with travel and business and freight, seconds cost thousands and thousands of euros and dollars. And this just adds up. And then we could potentially even have scenarios where people's lives could be in danger. So as I said, really quickly about the consequences and dangers of something going wrong in the sector. Obviously, there's the financial one. There's financial loss, any kind of disruption connected also to service interruption. That adds up. These are systems that need to go on clockwork. Everything's interconnected. So you have heavy financial loss here if something might go wrong. You have service interruption. Maybe something is delayed. As I said, maybe the signaling doesn't work, or someone's playing some crazy game through an RDP connection at one of the major stations. If you imagine Waterloo in London, perhaps, or one of the main train railway stations in Frankfurt or in Munich or Paris or anywhere else in the world. So all of this, it will become a cataclysmic knock-on effect, which will really interrupt and cause a lot of frustration. Also then the recovery costs. So if something does go down, we often think, okay, well, what is it going to take to resume business? What will it take? And all the different types of losses that are incurred through there. Regulatory fines, I already said, GDPR, PCI DSS, various forms of actual penalties that can come towards an organization. There was that instance a few years ago on Heathrow Airport where there was a USB stick found, which had a lot of vital information, travel information, very, very sensitive information, which even included things about the protecting the queen herself. So a lot of things there were actually shared and lost. And that ended up going to a level where the Data Protection Service in the UK actually went and sued and moved against the airport itself. And I think Heathrow was charged several hundreds of thousands of pounds. So again, here we have regulation. Of course, we've all heard and read in the news certain organizations have breached, especially with GDPR. Reputational one, of course, like if you see a railway service or maybe Uber or Bolt or maybe some kind of railway carriers or any kind of maybe airplane carriers, we then say, okay, well, if they've been breached, I will probably be less likely to use them. I will just go down to the next one, and I will go to the one that hasn't been breached. We look at things that have happened in the last few years, particularly with British Airways. And the major one, which was Cathay Pacific, which I'll mention in a moment. And of course, there's one which you find in particular in this sector here, is you have passenger and customer safety. You can really create a lot of problems on the roads, on the rails, at ports, on highways, where if this is done, unfortunately, in a way that is too dangerous and effective, it could very well affect lives, and it could hurt and potentially lead to injury and fatalities. So we have to keep that in mind as well as I think the worst. I mean, losing credit card data is one thing, but then if we actually put people's lives at risk, that's something totally different. Right. On this, I'm just going to run through this very briefly. I mean, in the past, we have done several sessions on zero trust and zero trust PAM. So some of the ways of mitigating some of this risk here is, of course, utilizing this strategy, and PAM becomes part of that foundation in order to secure privileged access accounts, which, as I said earlier, proliferate heavily and have really key and root account information and power to move around in different networks and do a lot of damage, grant you basically essentially the keys to the castle. With also the demands of regulations, as I said, healthcare, data protection. This is something that is vital. We're zero trust. In that mantra, never trust, always verify. The essence is segmentation. So we're trying here to really block lateral movement as much as possible. We're trying to control, to track, and to monitor activity, and that can be done with something like zero trust PAM. We're looking ultimately to improving and optimizing the workflow and securing access to various access points. That can only be done by session recording, making sure we know who and where and what was accessed. And ultimately, we're trying to make sure that we have an environment where everything in terms of our infrastructure, our freight, our air cargo, commuters, travelers, et cetera, are doing everything at the most safe level. And zero trust comes into that as one of the main ways to try and achieve it. And I really encourage you, if you haven't seen it, that to look at our website and our YouTube channel, because we do cover zero trust more in depth and what that looks like. Right. So how do we keep secure? Like, what is the ideal way here? All these terrible things that could happen. And of course, many will answer, well, VPNs, that's the way to do it. That's one way to mitigate attacks. Great way to start. Absolutely. MFA, yes, for sure. Always want to have different factors to authenticate access. And of course, password vaults, as most of the actual privileged accounts and credential theft is what's leveraged to actually do most of these attacks. So I would look at all this and I say, these are all great, but this is still not enough. These, in turn, all of these have their weaknesses. We know through a lot of the work that Gartner is putting out at the moment that VPNs are very much on their way out in the next few years. Yes, MFA is great, but we've had, unfortunately, recently certain instances where we've seen that that's not enough. We had organizations that have been breached despite using MFA. Password vaults, again, not enough to secure everything. Much of these things are very much what happens in front of the door. If I can use an analogy, what we need to know is what's happening behind the door. What is happening by those resources that are accessed? by those sessions that are being used. We cannot see that kind of detail simply with these typical and traditional types of ways to keeping secure. And that's where we go into more of a detail of what actually session monitoring and privilege access management can do to assist in that. And that's where I'm going to hand over now to my colleague, Rafał Wiosny, who'll show you a little bit more of how this looks like on the technical side at one of our clients in the public transportation sector, one of the major cities in Europe, and how they're utilizing the system. And so I'm just going to pass over to Rafał right now.
Thanks, Sasha. Let me switch to my presentation. Now, over the years, we've had quite a few deployments in the transportation area. From airports using Fudo to monitor both infrastructure access and employee work, to municipal transportation service companies monitoring external contractors' sessions. The latter is a crucial area where Fudo bolsters customers' ability to track and record daily procedures and changes in the systems. I would like to present you with two use cases to show how Fudo can help you maintain control over IT systems you may run or contract to run by third parties. Fudo is very fast and easy to deploy. That's a fact. Even when you're new to the product, we have free video tutorials that will guide you through the process of deploying Fudo. From my experience, I would say it's a matter of getting the logistics right to achieve the best results. Sometimes you can just tell your contractors starting at 8 a.m. on insert date, please use this IP and port to gain access to systems that you need to do your job. And you may check this earlier since it's up already. And on specified date, you can just block all accesses on your firewall so contractors cannot connect directly. But there are other more complicated deployments or systems in which you cannot use this approach, especially in environment when contractors operate infrastructure that is either leased or contracted as a service. This is also an area where Fudo can be used, but the subsequent use case will cover this. Now let's stick to the usual VPN access most of you are familiar with. This is the most classic remote access setup run by companies. A VPN server, a group of users connecting to the network and then to servers, sometimes just to launch a browser to operate applications with web access only. But most of the time, VPN users are using a protocol of some kind, like most popular remote desktop protocol, which is run 90% of cases. Sometimes they use SSH or secure shell, a text-only protocol used in more sophisticated control systems, or VNC protocol in some cases. And as I said, nowadays, work is shifting to web-based interfaces that have become more common. But the schema is pretty much unchanged since early 2000s. The user establishes a secure VPN connection, connects to a server or a web page, and does a contracted job. And you have no control over it, nor any mean of actually seeing what the user is doing or what the user did. Now, with Fudo in the path, you not only gain access to a recording of what was actually done, but a live view is available to monitor their actions. Alternatively, you can leverage Fudo's AI module to offload session scanning and reporting any unusual action user took, even in real time. One of the strongest advantages you get after deploying Fudo in your infrastructure is the ability to cut the link between the session authentication and the actual credentials used to connect to systems. The most common use case here is to let VPN users authenticate with Active Directory credentials or VPN credentials and then show them a list of servers the user is allowed to access using Fudo's built-in user access gateway feature. And I'm not talking about just plain passwords here. Fudo PAM supports multi-factor authentication schemes like Active Directory static password plus Duo token, or VPN login name plus Google Authenticator token, or domain login plus Microsoft MFA token as a second factor. Whatever authentication method you choose for the user to prove their identity, this person can either connect to a server or network switch using industry standard protocols like RDP or SSH, or use Fudo's user access gateway to launch a session using a link or built-in web client. Now, the trick here is to give access to an account with a different login and password, which only you as an administrator know. It could be a service account that the contractor use, or an administrator account with a password change every hour. And in the case of SSH connections, you may switch the authentication mechanism from password-based to key-based, and only Fudo knows the right key. Right, but you may ask, why does it matter in this use case? Well, by providing third parties passwords and logins to the infrastructure, you're giving away any control of their actions. Fudo's simple yet effective mechanism of credential substitution enables you to keep the control on your side and maintain access clearance on the lowest possible level that does not interfere with the ability to do contracted work. Right, now let's talk about the second use case. In 2021, we've had an interesting Fudo deployment for a transportation company providing a service to more than 500,000 passengers a day. The deployment aimed to oversee actions of the contractor companies maintaining systems which some of the companies are vendors of. This was a challenge for Fudo Security since the client did not have the control over the vendor's part of infrastructure, and it was always on access through IPsec tunnels. And we are not talking about monitoring access to SAP servers nor Excel sheets. That was the infrastructure critical to the operation of public service. Problems with accessing these systems could actually disturb the city's transportation network. Definitely not a walk in the park. The first challenge we faced was intercepting traffic going back and forth between the contractor company and the systems which operators will operate. On this simplified diagram, you can see how we've approached the problem. Network traffic from different companies is delivered in separate virtual networks or VLANs and passed through Fudo, acting as a bridge between the contractor company and the infrastructure they operate. One of the sometimes overlooked features of Fudo PAM is the ability to fit seamlessly between the user and the server or device to which they are connecting to. This is called bridge mode, since it bridges two network paths, so the user is unaware of Fudo processing the traffic. And in this case, we had to bridge more than 20 networks used by different companies to access their part of the infrastructure in real time. And that's not the hard part here. The hard part was customers' complete lack of access credentials to the endpoints. These are very niche systems, often built for the client, and yet we had to provide a way to authenticate each session and record it for later analysis if needed. So we've developed a strategy to provide session authentication and access to servers for companies with no knowledge of the credentials. Thankfully, most of the connections used either RDP or SSH protocol. Let me demonstrate how we did it. So I will be launching a remote desktop client. This is the normal way that user connects to the server. This IP is the server's IP, it's not Fudo's IP, and Fudo will intercept the traffic when we connect to this server. So let's connect. Okay, static password here, nothing fancy, but it could be Google Authenticator token, it could be a Duo token, it could be a radius password from a VPN server. It does not matter for Fudo, you can configure this as you wish. So let's log in, and now this is the first time that user sees that the traffic is going through Fudo, not directly to server. As you can see, the name of the remote computer is Fudo Security. It's not the server's name, so you know that the session is being recorded. Okay, so we are prompted now with the login reason. This is the extra step that you can configure for users to take. Users can put in the reason for connecting in here, so you keep record of the sessions. And since we are just testing, let's put testing bridge mode. Okay, so this is the next step. The whole thing I'm showing you here is a two-step authentication. We have authenticated in the first place with Fudo, but now we have to authenticate with the remote server, and these are the credentials that the client does not have. Only the contractor has login and password to server, so this is the way that we can allow access session recording to servers that the client does not have credentials to. So let's log in as admin user. Remember, this is unknown to the client. Those credentials are only known to the contractor that is accessing this server. And here is the session, and it's just any other session to the server. You can access remote files from the workstation that you're connecting from. And let's take a look what we can see in Fudo. Let's log in. Oh, sorry. Okay, so we have one session running, and let's take a look. And in this list, you actually know who's connecting. It's not anonymous sessions with administrator as login name. You actually know that this is Bob from Acme connecting to this Windows server. So let's take a look at this, the session viewer. So the session is rendered in real time, and let me bring back the window with the session here. So let's take a look. And yeah, this is the session. So everything that user does in the session is rendered in real time in Fudo. And of course, there is a little trick that the client can use. The client can actually join the session. So let's join this session here. And now the client can start navigating in the session, and the events will be injected to this session. So the remote user will see that someone is moving windows for him or for her, and contractor can, for example, ask for help, and actually the client can join the session and help the user or the contractor. So let's go back to our use case discussion. Well, the client had to go to every company and discuss this approach with engineers and operators to see if they would comply with the new way of connecting. But surprisingly, there was a little or no resistance, since the companies are now used to working with session recording systems, which are becoming increasingly common in the IT infrastructure. A critical step in the whole deployment was configuring Fudo's bridge mode beforehand. As a proof of concept, we've worked closely with one of the companies to ensure bridge setup won't break their sessions, and later tested the new authentication scheme with them. Our Fudo PAM setup passed every test. It was clear that the strategy was working, so we've extended the bridge to other companies' private networks or VLANs. From this point on, Fudo PAM was capable of intercepting any session that the customer wanted to. All the customer had to do was to turn session recording for each of the systems. An operation as trivial as adding IP address or IP subnet to Fudo setup. This way, monitoring can be turned on for each system separately, step by step. And it worked. Here you can see a screen of a multi-hour session for one of the key systems a major vendor is now running through Fudo. I believe that it took weeks to go through this process, but in the end, each session to a critical system was authenticated and recorded by Fudo. And since we've planned this carefully and did extensive testing with one of the companies, the client had no trouble setting Fudo PAM for other services operated by third parties. Before I end, let me tell you a secret. FudoPAM has another mode of operation that provides the same level of transparency, but the setup is more straightforward. It's called Gateway Mode, and we'll cover this in more detail in another webinar. But for now, let's just say that it includes a particular firewall or router setup way less complicated than the actual network engineering required for a bridge mode operation. If you're interested in seeing how it works, just contact us at Fudo Security. We'll run a demo session showing you how easy it is to set up and configure FudoPAM and discuss your needs in securing access to your most crucial systems. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Rafal. Really, really interesting. And I think that many of you have now seen exactly what I was talking about earlier, is how key this really is to secure this transportation sector. As we said, this is a vital component of any economy in any nation. And as I said, like, as something goes wrong, it's hundreds of thousands of people who will potentially be very much disrupted, annoyed, and potentially in danger. So this is where another case of how something like a privileged access management solution is just key for transportation. Of course, here we've seen just one of the elements of what Fudo can do. And clearly there is much more. There are other features and other types of capabilities that Fudo can do. So for instance, let's just running through here the advantages like unmatched session recording that we have, as we've demonstrated a little bit here by using RDP, SSH, and also HTTPS sessions. And that is something that we really have pioneered in terms of session recording, where you have really the necessary things to see what is going on within all the different types of intricacies of transportation. Also with our AI-driven prevention, and we're also moving now into something very different, where we're actually going into preventing attacks, trying to look at behavior that is suspicious and actually going forward. And that can really only be done if you have the right kind of foundational systems in place, foundational type of knowledge. So this is something that we're also moving into, is looking at preventing behavior very, very quickly that might be suspicious or strange. Then also we have our one-day deployment guarantee. I know that sometimes it can be a little bit more complicated with certain systems, but at the same time, this is something really vital that we really stand behind. And then moving here into just looking towards the future. And if we are looking at the transportation sector, and there are some breaches that I had already mentioned earlier, when we run through them quite quickly, it was the Cathay Pacific, the largest aviation breach. That's 9.4 million customers in, I think it was 2019, where it's the biggest one that ever happened in the aviation industry. You're looking at names, date of birth stolen, looking at a lot of different things that were actually taken. And this is something that is really vital to understand, because although the airline said that, because the IT team will be looking at not just the travel information, customer information of what's happening, but the carrier IT team will also be looking at things like the location and flight data. Was that compromised? They said no, but at the same time, this is very, very possible. So again, aviation, although it's definitely trying its most to protect itself, still has these breaches, which shouldn't really be happening anymore. Also, going back into more on the industrial side, on the freight side, we have an AP Moller-Maersk's computer systems were attacked in 2017. So that led to a domino effect, really, of a lot of global port disruption, right? And this affected everything from Los Angeles, New York, New Jersey, to India's largest container port, I believe in Mumbai. So that left Muller's whole organization with about $300 million in damages, and for 2 weeks of transport disruption. So again, these are things that are happening. There are other types of breaches that came very close to harming people's lives. There was a light rail incident in the United States where thankfully nothing happened, but these things are all possible. So again, when we're dealing with transportation IT security, we have a lot of challenges, as I've said, but a lot of opportunities to do it right. But there's still the dangers of something going wrong are really something that could really have serious consequences, reputational, financial, but also in terms of loss of life potentially. Right. So with that, I want to open the floor now in terms of questions because we have a little bit of time. So if any questions at this point, please feel free. You have a Q&A tab there to respond. So let us know if there are any questions that you have at this point in time.
I see 2 questions.
Okay, great.
Does Fudo support web session recording? And the answer is yes. We do support recording web sessions, but we do this in a different way. This is a graphical session recording, so you see actually what the user is doing in the browser, not the responses and from the server. So it's basically a graphical session recorded in Fudo, just the way that RDP or VNC sessions are recorded. And the second question is AI prevention cloud-based? And the answer is no. Every AI aspect of Fudo is run locally, so you do not send your data to the cloud. You are not required to set up any special service in the cloud or pay for the service. Everything is built into Fudo and it's on premises. It might be hardware, appliance, or VM running AI prevention and scanning in real time.
Great. And I mean, if there are any other questions, please feel free to just get in touch with us. I know that many of you come from around the world. We've connected here today, sending out this stream from the heart of Europe. But of course, we have many people from around the world joining us. So we'll be reaching out to you, making this available to you. And of course, through our global partner network, will also be available for questions also in your local language. So if that be English or German or Russian or anything else, we have that partner support available for you. So I want to conclude. Thank you so much for all your attendance here. Thank you so much for attending this session here. Also kind thanks to my colleague, Rafał Wiosna, for showing us a little bit more detail about Fudo PAM. And if anything else in future, please don't hesitate to get in touch and have a wonderful day.
Yep. Bye.
Bye-bye.